Chapter 6. Vesalius and Harvey used their eyes. Slowly the world moved on. During the 15th and 16th centuries, the people of Europe awakened as if from a dream. It was the time of the Renaissance. New trade routes had been started toward the east, new markets established, new cities built. Mariners, their little ships equipped with compasses, sailed out across unknown seas, rounded the coast of Africa, crossed the ocean to the Americas, while the telescope set others exploring the limitless skies. Now, as if to help in spreading news of great adventures, the printing press was made, and paper was imported in quantity from Egypt. It was no longer necessary to copy manuscripts laboriously by hand on expensive parchment. Now people began to investigate what before had been hidden. They stared at a Greek statue dug from the earth and realized the vitality of the ancient artists. With help of Arab or Hebrew scholars, they read Greek manuscripts not translated and marred by frequent copying, but in the original. They read it freshly, as it had first been written, and the classics of antiquity were reborn for them. You can still see evidence of the vitality of the thought of that time in the work of the painters, in the affectionate and careful observation of flower and leaf, of bird and beast and man. Botticelli painted 30 different kinds of wild flowers in his picture Spring. Michelangelo, lying on his scaffold in the Sistine Chapel, painted the strong, graceful bodies of men and women in the Bible stories he illustrated. Albrecht Dürer in Germany made a woodcut of a rhinoceros, modeling his work on the drawing of such an animal sent by a friend from Portugal, and Leonardo da Vinci filled his notebooks with sketches of birds' wings and of bones and joints as if he could not see enough of them or ever tire of recording what he saw. Not only was Leonardo an artist, but he was one of the world's great scientists. However, since the time of the Greeks, there had been few other real scientists in Europe. Then Andreas Vesalius and William Harvey were born. Neither Vesalius nor Harvey set out to do anything at all revolutionary. Both men simply used their eyes and set down what they had seen rather than what tradition had taught them. As it happened, both men were chiefly interested in the human body. Vesalius, the Belgian, described its bones and muscles. Harvey, the Elizabethan Englishman, tried to understand how it functioned. The two men never saw each other, for Vesalius died 14 years before William Harvey was born. Andreas Vesalius came from Brussels. His ancestors for many generations had been doctors, so perhaps it was natural that since boyhood he had been interested in the bodies of both animals and men. It must have been a great satisfaction when he himself was sent to the University of Louvain and later to Paris to study medicine. But he had not been at the University of Paris long before he grew restless and left, having decided that he could work as well at home. Soon he was collecting bones at the places of public executions and dissecting animals, and before long he had succeeded in putting a whole human skeleton together. Gradually he gained a great reputation among physicians and scholars, so that they came from miles around to watch his dissecting operations. He moved on to Venice, and then he received an appointment as professor at the University of Padua. It was a great thing for a young man to teach at the University of Padua in those days, for that was the scientific center of Europe. Students from everywhere in plumed hats and flowing capes went there to study. Sometimes Vesalius had as many as 500 students at his demonstrations. The old three-storied building where he taught may still be seen, its lecture rooms on the upper stories and a row of little shops on the ground floor. Over the arch of the great front door you may still read Gymnasium Omnium Disciplinarum, the university of all departments of learning. Above this is carved the great seal of the city of Padua and the words, "Enter in such mood that you daily come out wiser." According to the usual practice of that time, Vesalius read his lectures to the students in Latin, quoting from the Greek authority for his statements. Beside him at his table, a surgeon barber acted as demonstrator, pointing out the various parts of the human or animal body under discussion. The assistant used a crude knife, for new dissecting instruments had not been invented. But since Vesalius was of an impatient disposition, it was not long before he had thrust the demonstrator aside and was demonstrating his lectures for himself. It was the custom then for the students to elect their own professors, and since Vesalius was very popular, he was chosen to lecture at Padua for 5 successive years. At the end of this time, in 1542, while he was still only 28 years old, he published a book to sum up the results of his lectures and demonstrations. It was called The Fabric of the Human Body, and it was dedicated to Emperor Charles V, the greatest monarch of his time. Vesalius decided to illustrate his book with woodcuts, and he chose one of Titian's most gifted pupils, Jan Stephen van Kalkar, to make the illustrations for him. They were so beautifully executed that some people thought Titian himself had made them. Vesalius regarded the human body of which he wrote as a work of art, and thought that God himself was the great artist. He described the overlapping muscles of living men, and had them drawn not in the form of diagram, but as if one could see them through the skin. In all the years that have passed since Vesalius' time, no one has drawn living muscles so beautifully as they were drawn in this book. Anatomists still go back to it to learn from these drawings. The bones and joints are also shown, starting with the skull, which Vesalius measured and compared with the skulls of other animals, and these drawings also have singular beauty and accuracy. The whole work is done with sincerity and care, but this very carefulness brought trouble to its author, not only from the Church, but from other physicians, for Vesalius' conclusions were not in accordance with tradition. The physicians objected because he showed that in the human body the lower jaw is but a single bone, not divided as the Greeks had taught. They were also indignant because he showed that the breastbone had 3 parts and not 8. What caused him special difficulty was the thigh bone. He stated that in humans it was straight, not curved as in a dog. His old teacher Silvius was furious with this statement. Vesalius' ideas were newfangled and dangerous, he said. Of course the Greeks were right. Men had undoubtedly changed their thigh bones by foolish practices. Wearing tight trousers had probably straightened out their natural curves. Theologians were even more vehement against Vesalius than were the physicians. It was commonly accepted that a man had one less rib on one side than on the other, since Eve had been fashioned out of one of Adam's ribs. And it was also believed that every man had what was called a resurrection bone, around which his new body was formed on the resurrection day. But Vesalius could give no account of either the missing rib or the resurrection bone. Yet though his eyes told him that the facts he had put in his book were true, Vesalius did not want to break with the old teachings or to disturb the pattern of thought that men had held so long. He was a devout man. The fabric of the human body was a beautiful thing to him, fashioned by God, and he could not force himself to say he had seen anything he had not seen. Vesalius' work on the human body was so distinguished that he has been called one of the greatest scientists of modern times, but he was too radical for his own age. He was forced to resign his post at Padua and move back to Venice and then to Jerusalem. No one knows what finally happened to him. William Harvey, the Englishman who followed Vesalius, sympathized completely with his point of view. Both were conservatives, not wanting to upset the old established ways, but something in them both made them use their eyes and set down what they had seen. Whereas Vesalius had described the human body's structure so beautifully, Harvey wanted to know how it functioned. There's no way of knowing how Harvey became interested in the operation of heart, lungs, and digestive tract. Perhaps he did not know himself. He was born in Folkestone in England. His father was mayor of the town. Since his father was a prosperous man, the boy was given a good education, an advantage that was denied to poor boys then. He went to school in Canterbury and afterward was sent up to Cambridge. And in due course, he too traveled to Padua, not to teach, but to study. He wanted to study medicine. At Padua, he sat with other students in a small, candlelit amphitheater and looked down at an aged professor named Fabricius, who lectured on the valves of the veins. It was not long before young Harvey made friends with Fabricius, who taught him all he knew. Most of this he had to unlearn later, for Fabricius's views were altogether wrong. He held that the blood was manufactured from food taken into the body, that it lay in the veins and hollow nerves as in irrigation ditches until it gradually evaporated like water in a field. Harvey studied at Padua for some time and then went back to England to receive his degree as Doctor of Medicine. That was in the year 1602. He received an appointment as lecturer at the College of Physicians in London, and it was then that he made his great discovery. There are two portraits of William Harvey which may still be seen. One hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in London, the other in the College of Physicians. In both pictures you can see his round face, his small round black eyes, which even in a picture are full of spirit, the hair worn rather long and straggling down on his round white collar. But pictures cannot give a sense of his quick, nervous speech, his gesturing hands, or the temper that often flared up. There are memories of his friends and students that tell of these. Yet though his temper was volatile, he was very careful and deliberate and slow in his work. He would make no statement until he had tested his facts again and again. He would not allow his great book on the circulation of the blood to be published until after he was 50, though he had established his theory long before that time. We speak of it today as a great book, though it is only 72 pages long. It was written, of course, in Latin and very poorly printed, but that did not matter. Neither did its rather forbidding title make any difference. It was called Essay on the Motion of the Heart and the Blood. People since then have spoken of the book as On the Circulation of the Blood. Harvey starts his book by explaining the old theories. According to these, food was converted to the liver into the blood, and this passed through the vein partly to the heart in order to receive the spiritus vitalis, as the vital spirit was called, and partly into the body. Then he explains that he'd studied 40 different kinds of animals to see whether this is what actually took place. Among them were worms, insects, crustaceans, and fish, and finally the hearts of men. After this he tells how he examined the human heart very carefully. It must be a hollow vessel, he thinks. He notices how the blood passes from the right auricle to the right ventricle, and so into the pulmonary vein, with little valves to prevent its flowing in the wrong direction. Then he points out how it flows in a similar manner on the left side. And then he begins to calculate. If the pulse beats 72 times a minute, in an hour 640 ounces of blood would be forced into the ventricle. That would be 8,640 ounces in an hour, he estimates, or 540 pounds. That would be 3 times the weight of a man. Think on this extraordinary computation, checking it over, wondering whether he could have made an error. A thought strikes him. Quote, I began to think whether there might not be a movement, as it were, in a circle. Unquote. And again he says, quote, all things, both argument and ocular demonstration, thus confirm that the blood passes through lungs and heart by force of the ventricles, and is driven thence and sent forth to all parts of the body, that it makes its way into the veins and pores of the flesh. It flows by the veins everywhere, from the circumference to the centre, from the lesser into the greater veins. By them it is discharged into the vena cava, and finally into the right auricle of the heart. The blood is carried in one direction by the arteries, in the other by the veins, in so great a quantity that it cannot possibly be supplied all at once from the food that is taken into the body. It is therefore necessary to conclude the blood of animals is impelled in a circle, and in a state of ceaseless movement. It must be, moreover, that the circulation in the act or function of the heart, which performs this act or function through its vessels. Unquote. But this was not enough. He wanted to prove his theory, so he tied a tight cord around his arm and showed how veins swell up below the ligature. And he severed a vein and an artery and showed how they bled differently. Finally, he stated his conclusions. The arteries carry blood from the heart out into the body. There it is passed into the ramifications of the veins and flows from these into the principal vein and so back into the heart. He could not explain exactly how the veins and arteries were connected. The microscope had not yet been invented, and no one knew of the capillary system. The circulation of the blood in the body, which Harvey described, was a new conception, one that was contrary to the teachings of all former ages. He was the first man to explain the bodily process, yet he took little credit for his brilliant theory. He thought that Aristotle had perhaps described the same process, but he could not find where the Greek biologist had written it down. Harvey's findings were accepted without much hesitation. That is perhaps proof of how fast men's thoughts were changing. Even in his own lifetime, physicians took the circulation of the blood as a matter of course. Madam-ch. He was never criticized as Vesalius had been only a few years before. Almost unintentionally, both men had used their eyes for seeing and had pushed aside the practice of relying on authority. In the years ahead, this was to be a common